I want to share some of the behind the scenes kind of integrations, these marvelous habits that we spent the last few weeks going through. I want to kind of show the behavioral habits, what I consider to be the more brain-based habits, approaches, and of course the AI interaction at the end. I want to begin though with always where I begin with the end in mind, which is our sense of self. And our sense of self, that self-insight into how our brain works. How that insight and why it's important to have that insight, because it helps, it increases, it expedites the likelihood of being able to manifest these habits that these books have done a phenomenal job of, enticing us to do. And of course, there's also the narrative that we tell ourselves about these ongoing changes. So it's, even though the books try and deconstruct these formulae into a simple way, the reality is sense of self is not the simplest issue. That being said, it is surprising how really, really simple habits are and how long it's been known for, that we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence is then not an act, but a habit. Aristotle, for goodness sake. And here we are, all this time later, with the same basic essence of the elements that comprise every one of our habits. The cue, a little routine of repeating what you want to change, and a reward. And all of these books that I'm going to very briefly summarize, and Michael asked me to extrapolate a little more on the brain stuff that I've done, they're all essentially just variants of these very simple, very well-known ideas. What is changed, what is different, what is escalated is the insight into how to personalize it, how to measure it. The field is still very much driven and persuaded by these three major gurus who are, as all books that scale, brilliant writers. Neither of them, James Clear, B.J. Fogg, or Charles Duhigg, to my knowledge, is a brain scientist. James Clear and B.J. Fogg are behaviorists. And they have done this truly brilliant job. So let's start with the fact that they all have a slightly different focus. James Clear and B.J. Fogg focus on the cue, routine, reward, and then I'm just suggesting now a distillation context pattern. In James Clear, the beautiful, one of many beautiful concepts, that habits compound incrementally. Tiny habits, I think one of his many fantastic insights is that celebrating rewards immediately is a big factor. The many others we'll come to in a moment. But it really, once we get to Charles Duhigg, this guy, he's just marvelous. He really looks at it a little more holistically. And he's saying, hold on, people, let's look at the whole process, the whole habit loop routine, because maybe that's one way to go. And he really embraced the neuroscience and AI. And I'm very much more focused on the AI. I really do believe that AI is prescient, but I want to add the importance of the brain in helping to integrate these insights. It's a convergence of these three marvelous books, and you think about some brain issues. That's not for everybody to do that. Some people would prefer a simple formula, and that's great, because there is no unique way to generate habits. It absolutely is contingent on a hyper-personalization. So let's spend a couple of minutes on each one. Let's take atomic habits. Let's start. And this brilliant idea and concept, and it's been so persuasive on 30 million books. It's like 1% compounding leads to big changes. So he really does highlight the importance of those tiny, small steps. And he obviously also articulates focusing on the goal, not on the goals, but on the whole system. Focus on the system and on your identity. You don't just want to change being running 5 kilometers, you want to become a runner. He is talking about a long range investment where you go through this valley of disappointment because you can't see the change because it's not big enough yet. The compounding hasn't kicked in, and that's like saving money. And that's like everything else in life. And for better or for worse, many, many people find this incredibly helpful. My personal view, yep, probably if you're a stoic and you've got a personality type that's disciplined and you've got tremendous self-regulation and there's not any massive, pain and distraction in your life, this is for you. And I think this will work in a lot of people, not by no means in everybody, in my opinion. From what I've seen in the human brain, in the world's first and largest standardized brain database, the massive variability of what people need is not so straightforward. But this has been the most popular and the most successful model I'm aware of, and he deserves every accolade and outcome that he has. But it is by no means a one-size-fits-all for behavior change. And he then appeals to the long-term part of the brain, which, as we know, this postponement of gratification is not what the brain's good at naturally. So we need that layer of slow momentum and to see and value the problem. So that is great. And similarly, B.J. Fogg, equally brilliant writer, much more, Stanford, detail, articulate, super smart, uses all the cachet of Stanford to the max. And he does a brilliant job of really deconstructing habits. He really highlights these small changes, and he really puts it into a formula, which is quite brilliant, to just go, it's just behavior, is motivation plus ability plus the prompt. And that he then shows how this interaction between motivation, if something's low or high in motivation, and ability, that it's hard to do or it's easy to do, how easily you can then have what he calls the action line, which is neuroscience would call the threshold of activation, where you actually hit the threshold. But he really has, more than anybody captured that this is a systematic process, and beyond more than just aggregation, he really adds, I think, beautifully to Clear's concepts. And I see the two of them as incredibly complementary. If you just slide the two of them together, you see these beautiful complementary ideas sort of pop out. And so, this motivation can fluctuate, but, you can hit these thresholds. The action line doesn't. So if you just play around with high and low motivation and ability, you can kind of really apply that to any habit. And he gives beautiful examples of high and low motivation changing based on circumstance or information, and how you can, if you get the right combination, you can get over the action line, bottom line. Anyway, so it begins to talk and articulate and make explicit habits in a dynamical way. So the higher the motivation, obviously, the higher the likelihood it's going to happen. The harder it is, the least likely. Now we come to my, a little bit biased, opens the door to a little bit of neuroscience. He's guided by neuroscience, and he uses a beautiful little example of he uses a rat, well, the cat, these poor cats and rats. But anyway, this rat, it was a study done by Anne Greville, and it just put I think it was 150 sensors into the rat's brain, and here the rat had to get out and get the chocolate in the top right-hand corner, and they didn't just time the chocolate, but they looked at the brain waves. So you don't need to know much about brain science to see that on the left little picture is his brain spiking neurons going crazy. And then as it started to do more trials, the middle parts of the brain firing started to synchronize. So the neurons that fired together, wired together, it started to synchronize, the habits started to kick in. And now you only had firing at the beginning, where you had the cue and when you had the reward, or at the beginning of the trial, I think it was in this case where the rat's learning, and then at the end, it's like now, getting the reward. But you can see another deep principle of neuroscience started to emerge, which is that when you're in automatic, you need less firing, because now you're getting synchronization. Ultimately, it's the kind of ultimate example of it is flow. So when you're in flow, the strange thing is that, and we've seen this, we've seen it on our data, you see less firing, less blood flow, because now the brain is everything is resonant. It's all aligning up to some degree. So he really had, his conceptual framework was more system, but brain system. Super emphasis on small steps. He's going, yes, but not so fast. What about, and these are my words now, what about if you're super ready to change? What about if you've got the ability to integrate this information very quickly? Because we know that if you aim for a habit that's too big or too quick, your likelihood is you will fail. But it doesn't mean that that's the case for everybody. So he's now opening the door to say, depending on where we are with the pieces, we can look at maybe bigger changes or other options in terms of systems and thinking about this. And there was a Starbucks example. You probably all saw the example. It was shocking, actually, where Starbucks used to employ these kids as they came out of school. And somewhere, what do kids know when they come out of school? Next to nothing. And they'd have long shifts. They were 8-hour shifts. And by 6 or 7 hours, they were tired and irritable. Some of them weren't. Some of them were marvelous, obviously. But anyway, you got a big company here. They were generating, I think, $150 million a year at that time. Anyway, one kid had a bit of a interaction with a woman who ordered a coffee, and when she wrote her name on the cup, she wrote her name was bitch. So the woman finished the coffee, went outside, called the media, showed them the cup, and said, what is going on? And of course, if you want to see $150 million revenue per year being going up in smoke, there's a good hint of a match. So they were panicked, and they of course, Howard Schultz is, I don't ever think he was selling coffee. He was always selling service, and Duhigg emphasizes that he's selling quality service, basically. And so this was a disaster. And so the bottom line, though, is that they did something quite brilliant with training new people, all the employees, into better habit routines. So here again, Duhigg looked at the habit routine, the whole cued routine outcome. And they trained them in, I think the program was called the latte program or something. But anyway, they trained them with pre-packaged negative responses, how to deal with them. So if you're tired at the end of a shift and somebody irritates you, what are we going to get you to do? And they trained them up into sort of pre-habit routines so that their reactivity wasn't bad and that they sort of got them going. So he now started to preemptively train habit routines. Now there's another new dimension. So we take basically clear, Duhigg complementarity. Let's add to that. Why don't we train people to really prepare for their worst options and train it? And I do a lot of that with peak performers. Peak performers, they've got critical moments. They better be trained up for those critical moments, because nobody can deal with critical moments well unless they're super well trained. And that's why you can see phenomenal professional golfers. I mean, even, literally in the US Open a few weeks ago, missing putts of, literally 1.5, 2 feet. I mean, not 1, 2, and loses the reshove. And I mean, it's kind of Rory McIlroy. It's incredible, actually. You should definitely go and speak to Duhigg. But it's shocking. But there you go. Peak performance, critical moments at work, not just golf. Golf happens to be one of my passion sports. Unfortunately, I don't get time to play, but there it is. I play vicariously through my son. So lastly, he really mentions another big picture point worth thinking about as the big picture of this, which is keystone habits. There's some habits that are like keystone species that if you get that habit right, it'll affect all your habits. And of course, the 3 that I most focus on in keystone habits, obviously stress, stress mastery, positivity, and sleep. Obvious, sure. But obvious doesn't mean that people do it. Let me now spend a few minutes on integrating this into the neuroscience. And let's not forget that 40 to 45% of those 50,000 thoughts a day that I kept emphasizing are habits. And that has been studied by Wendy Ward, if those of you want to look it up. And she just followed people around and studied the automatic habits. I mean, it's very hard to quantify it too well, but there's a number of studies. That's just one that I think is one of the better ones. That's a lot of decision making is coming automatically from our habits. So to not have a deep appreciation of the triggers of our non-conscious brain that can cause brain fractures, that mismatch between our non-conscious, there's my little figure down there of the non-conscious and the conscious brain. I'll use the little metaphor iceberg for this, for our simple purposes tonight. But that is critical. And if as I say, every time we talk about this, if you take away nothing, and that's why I'm so glad Michael brought the bias cards. If you take away nothing from any time I present, take away spending, 5 minutes a day, reading a bias card, or of the 100 biases, or listening to a podcast about the non-conscious ways in which our brains are shaped. And here we already have from Duhigg that marvelous idea of if you don't feel you can change the non-conscious triggers, like if you get angry, for example, when you get criticized, just train the habits of how you're going to respond. I call it, as you would have seen in the book, I call it BEAM, Brain Emotional Awareness Mastery, that you can train the way you're going to respond. It's the only thing we have control over. So the second part is neuroplasticity, one of the single most powerful ways you can increase your likelihood of getting a result. So let's go a little bit through why. So let's begin with the neuroplasticity. So we know that neural networks that fire together wire together. You've seen this before. But I want you to now think about that a little more. Okay, so what is the process here? Now let's look at this picture on the right. This isn't a picture of what we think we know about how habit is really formed in the human brain. And as always, it starts off with emotions, which are just, as we know, they are basically in the fifth of a second, your brain is picking up cues that are either threatening or rewarding. So if it's a habit, you're going to pick up, is this cue, is this habit threatening or rewarding? Am I after a habit to stop threats and change them, or look for rewards? And then the second part is that the cortex, the outer part of your brain, the outer mantle of your brain, and to some extent, some of the prefrontal cortex particularly, that's where habits start. It's activated initially there. And then as you start repeating it, as you start going through the valley of disappointment, although there are other options to that, as you start doing that and incrementally get it to becoming automatic, the habit starts becoming a wiring program. And it starts going into what are called the basal ganglia. It's the deep nuclei in the brain, some of the basal ganglia. That is a remarkable thing to think about, that this is not an esoteric process. Each habit is not just a matter of sticking to a formulaic systematization. It is a marvelous journey of taking the cosmic symphony in your brain and turning and changing the way the whole fundamental orchestra plays. First, to all the instruments on the outside, and then either some of them move to the inside and connect more effectively, but you get a totally different kind of frequency, and literally that. And as we've seen from those firings, you start getting a more fluid, a more flowy, a more what I would call resonance of the drivers of the habit. And so my 3 steps, well, firstly, I'm saying the first point is probably the most significant, that it's about finding a personalized integrated plan. So I'm going to end off in a few minutes by encouraging us as we go to breakout to really think about what are the best integrative bits for you to make a habit. You know what your personalized preferences are, but I'm suggesting moreover that before you start training, obviously you've got to, readiness is my number 1 point, first step, you've got to know your why. And by the way, I want to just take a minute here to say, it's not just a matter of saying, know your why. Oh, I want to lose weight. Great. It's about know your why. As Ramdas would say, that's a big difference. It's not just know your why, it's know your why. And it's the why. Why? Yes, you want to lose weight. You want to eat less food. But when you're going to eat less food, in addition to all the obvious things, why are you stress eating? I mean, that level of why. Your non-conscious brain level of why. Why are you so stressed? Why are you using food as your soothing? That's the why I'm talking about. So I want you to just re-bring us pragmatically back to why do we need to know about our brain? Because why is it empowering? Because it's not only just about asking the right questions. It's about looking at our whole brain and that model in our own brain, how real it all is. Then we just the same thing, repeat action why, and I use prompts, action, rewards. It's the same principle. And then, of course, there's a third piece that is very different to, I think, what most of the main habit models are saying. But that's the principle. Let me start with the big issue, which is, what have we learned about behavior change in the last while, more than anything? And it's kind of akin to like growth mindset versus closed mindset. If you don't have a growth mindset, it's very hard to believe that you're going to do anything differently. Well, what is a growth mindset? It's an openness, of course. But what is it in the brain? Like, what is your brain neurons doing? I would suggest that the main thing is they're more flexible. Well, how do they get more flexible? That is the basis of neuroplasticity. That if you boost your brain's neuroplasticity to be more flexible, then you're more likely to make new connections. And new connections is what behavior change is. So what is this neuroplasticity? What am I on about how we can increase it? Well, the simplest way to think about it is as an accelerator and a brake. So we know that. So in the brain, we know there are two processes, but we know in the body, there are also two processes. And we all know that they are fight, flight, stress, and the vagus, calm, flexible system. So the accelerator is fight and flight. And the brake, literally the brake, that will also cause neuroplasticity, because when you're in fight, flight, you are not neuroplastic. You're about getting out of danger. Your heartbeat is consistent. It is not variable. Your literally your field of view closes down, so you can just get out as quickly as possible. Your everything, your rest and digest shuts down, and your muscles get as much oxygen and blood as possible. It is frightening how powerful and how amazingly brilliant it is in the short term to get out of danger, or a little bit useful. Stress is marvelously useful for focus, attention, until it's not. And it is one of the most toxic, brain-killing, inflammation-inducing systems we know. Cortisol at the end of it. So we have this adrenaline in the fight-flight, the red zone, all again triggered by emotion. Is emotion, threat, reward, threat, reward. If it's a threat, red zone, noradrenaline, and all these things that you probably can't read, which we all know about: pupils dilate, fast heart rate, low heart rate variability. Your variability is low, and that's a sign of high stress. Fast breaths, your gut is inactive, your muscles inactive. But then we have the marvelous green zone. If you can boost your green zone, you will not only put a brake on that stress system, but you will enhance your neuroplasticity. And if you do not do that, your chances of changing and rewiring are significantly lower. You'll do significantly worse in therapy. You'll do significantly worse in pretty much everything. Stress, toxic stress, is the greatest derailer of performance we know. So the vagus nerve, the relaxation response, acetylcholine, your pupils constrict, your heartbeat slows down, and it gets more variable. Because why? Because evolution is about variability. It's adaptation, even in these micro states. That is what is healthy. I remember when I was delivering babies as a young medical student, and if that baby's heartbeat started to become fast and irregular, we'd have to get it out of there. But We can activate the vagus. I've mentioned it every time I speak. I've urged people every time to go and look it up. And I urge you to do it again. His name is Herbert Benson. He's a Harvard cardiologist. He looked at a whole lot of other research. And he said, actually, the key to enhancing the vagus state is repetition of any stimulus. Let me just repeat that. Any stimulus, you will get that response. Yes, breath, perfect. But movement, sound, anything, a mantra that you repeat, you will enhance your neuroplastic state. So there you have it. I will just also say, because many of you have asked me behind the scenes about different medications, like antidepressants all work potentially if they get it right, and of course psychedelics. But if you can do it naturally, like with breath and like with sound, 90% of the time I would say and it works, and you do it intensely, you're off to the races. So basically, before we go into the breakout, I just want to obviously say something about AI, but I also want to remind you and encourage you to download, if you've got a better one, use it, but I've got a free 30-day challenge on my website in dreviangordon.com/habit plan, and there's this 30-day challenge down there. We just track it, because tracking it of your training every day. Did you do neuroplasticity training in the morning before you started? Did you do neuroplasticity resonant brain-body calm to affect your calm? Or if you were eating is your habit, did you do mindful eating? Did you use all the nudge stuff that we used in those nudge books? Like, did you use plates that were smaller rather than bigger? And know that if your plates are even smaller, your portion size will be smaller and you'll eat less and lose more weight. All of this convergence of the fantastic concept that Michael had of books that fire together, wire together. This is a place where you can bring them together, your own habit, and track them. And so I want to end off on two things. One, all of this is amazing information that we've been given by these books, but I would encourage us to think integratively. Books that fire together, wire together. Let's wire them together. So let's think about, when we talk about our personal ways of doing a habit at home, think about what works for you, WW for you, because it's not what you should do, it's what you will do. So if you think, for example, I'll just use this example, James Clear, value of disappointment is good, take that piece out. If you think in tiny habits, that the BMAP formula is a great structure, key, systematic, use that. If you think from Duhigg, the key habit, keystone habits are good, add that to your formula. If you think that in my brain habits, as you know, what I say in the video and in the book is that, yes, of course, you want to focus on the compounding habits, the dartboard metaphor at the back of my picture there. But every time you train, I would put a slightly different context to what James Clear and BJ Fogg say, which is every time you train, you should feel a dopamine buzz. In those 3 breaths that I showed you of 6 breaths per minute, if at the end of those 3 breaths, you have not felt more of a sense of presence and a sense of calm, find something that'll get you there, whether it's movement in Tai Chi or whatever it's going to be, a mantra, but find a way to feel a benefit right now. I personally advise not just relying on the value of disappointment. I say the opposite. Find the moment of joy in every single practice you have, every day, in every way, and watch them compound. And unfortunately, there's more before we end off on AI, Michael. And that is, there are unfortunately a miles bigger literature that I have studied for a long time. The fact of the matter is these things take other factors that are brain-based. In Duhigg's case, he focuses a lot on willpower. Willpower should not be underestimated. Personality type. It's important. If you're a potential personality type that's introverted and more kind of aligns with stoicism, it's really powerful. If, on the other hand, you're an INFP like me and you're extroverted and you're more like iterative, and it's a very different type of style of going to habit change. Resilience, massive factor. All of these have separate literatures about different facets, and they mainly to do with how the brain and behavior works affected. And lastly, something we covered in detail, our biases being top of the list. It's the number one bias and rule that I try and do, like Charles Darwin, every day: challenge our confirmations. Change your environment to some degree. Put the bad food out of sight. Put good food where you can see it. Obvious, but every aspect of our environment can be changed. So these nudges of the environment. And lastly, expectations. Remember when we did nudges about priming? And this is where I do love the book on influence, because he so shows how much of our behaviors, real world behaviors, how to get people to say yes, how to sell things, how to market things, are also about expectation management and priming. But also there's a lot of research, a whole research field that shows that if you have positive expectations, for example, about a habit change, your likelihood of success is orders of magnitude higher than if you have negative expectations. So all of these fields, for better or for worse, I think would be worthwhile spending a little bit of time just before you do your plan, personalized plan for your habit. And that is why I believe, last but not least in today's sharing, that AI is a timely and potential story. And as you know, my theme in my own AI podcast series is how can we use AI to enable the brain to use AI more effectively? And it begins prosaically with just onboarding people and personalizing, but helping with that personalizing. And then as it gets deeper into the possibilities that we're already bringing together, is bring all of it together. Getting that feedback loop going, having the chatbots go more than just a wraparound, which I think kind of, even though I love the chatbot and those other discussions, it's going to the microbots that are going out and looking at hyper-personalizing this. What are the biometrics that are going to work with you? How many, in all your preferences can be incorporated now into one integrated feedback loop that is tuned to, do I want things visually or auditorily? Which in all those tick boxes we went through, what am I? Am I a great starter and a poor finisher? And how do you help me get through my second and third week where I want to give up? All of these things can now be tuned. And how do I bring the biometrics? How can I use, like I use these biometrics? You can look at your stress every 6 seconds and get a map of what actually made you less stressed, not what you think made you less stressed, what actually did. And the bots can feed that back to you and tell you when you've crossed your thresholds and need an intervention, a decompression as we call it. And last, but by no means least, I know this may sound a little ungracious, but I really do believe that the data has not been well collected in habits. I mean, surveys are honestly a superficial insight into outcomes. We need data. We need real-time data, granular data, integrated data, and where better and how better if not through AI. And then use the AI tools to mine these tools like with Neuroflow and look at these new patterns and then feed the data back into the programs.
Wow, just amazing, just incredible kind of overview, summary. You have had, I think in 2024, probably the primary influence literally on this entire year when we did your book, and now it just kind of persists. And literally you are kind of leading me with these books like breadcrumbs to a kind of higher order integration that we can all use and deploy every day. And then plus adding AI, I mean, the potential here is really powerful. In real time, this is happening. We're going to get more agency over our decision-making and, ultimately unlock our conditioned self. So thank you so much. That was amazing.